Hey guys, tonight we begin with something warm, flickering and gloriously escapist. A night at the movies in 1930s America. Not the modern multiplex with heated recliners, assigned seating, and a small popcorn that costs roughly the same as a used lawnmower. I mean the real thing. The great gilded picture palaces of the Great Depression, where for one thin dime a broke, dusty, deeply anxious human being could walk out of the worst decade in living memory and straight into a marble lobby lit up like the inside of a jewellery box. Nobody had a job. Half the country was one bad harvest from disaster, and yet somehow there was always a nickel for the pictures. Because when your real life is falling apart, 2 hours in a dark room watching beautiful people fall in love on a boat is not a luxury. It is medicine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a real thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic, because honestly the best ideas on this channel come from you, not me. I just read them out in a soothing voice at 2 a.m. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is out there in the dark with me. And if you would rather drift off with your eyes closed, the channel is now on Spotify too, so you can find it through the link in the description and let it play while you fade out. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable and let your shoulders come down from around your ears. And let me fill your head with a few gentle questions before we go. Did people really put on their good hat and their good shoes just to sit in the dark? Could you actually afford a ticket when you could barely afford dinner? Why were the theatres colder than a butcher's freezer in July, and why did everyone love that so much? What exactly was in the popcorn, and why did it smell like heaven and regret? Did you truly walk in for one movie and stumble out 4 hours later, having watched 2 features, a cartoon, a newsreel, a serial, and a man get hit with a pie? And could you really win a free set of dinner plates just for showing up on a Tuesday? We will get to all of it. But first, congratulations. You have just woken up in 1936, your bank is nervous, your radio is full of bad news from Europe, and your paycheck, if you have one, is doing the work of 2. But it is Friday evening. The marquee down the street is glowing like a small sunrise. And for 25 cents, you're about to forget every single one of your problems. Grab your coat, the show starts soon. Let us start with the strangest part of this whole story, which is that you're broke and you're going anyway. This is the Great Depression. 1 in 4 people has no work, the newspaper is a daily horror show, and your household budget has the structural integrity of wet cardboard. And yet here you are, digging a quarter out of a coffee tin to go sit in the dark with strangers. It sounds insane until you understand the logic. The movies were the one place in America where a poor person and a rich person got the exact same seat, the exact same fantasy, and the exact same 2 hours of pretending everything was fine. Think about the world you're living in for a second. The banks have been failing like dominoes, and some of them took your neighbour's entire savings down with them. There are men selling apples on street corners who used to wear suits to offices. There are families packing everything they own into a rattling car and driving west toward a rumour of work. Everywhere you look, the message is the same, which is that the future has been cancelled until further notice. It is the kind of pressure that sits on your chest all day and refuses to get off, so you make a choice that looks completely irrational on paper. Instead of saving that quarter, instead of stretching it into another sad pot of beans, you spend it on a made-up story projected onto a wall. And the wild part is, this was not some rare indulgence. Millions of Americans did this every single week. At the depths of the worst economy in the country's history, something like 60 or 70 million people were going to the movies weekly. out of a population that was not much bigger than that. The nation was basically living at the theatre. Why? Because misery is exhausting and hope is a nutrient, and you cannot buy hope at the grocery store. But you could buy it at the box office for the price of a loaf of bread. It is a bit like today, when you have had the week from the underworld, and you know you should cook something responsible, and instead you order the expensive comfort food and put on a show you have already seen 4 times. You are not being frivolous. You are performing emergency maintenance on your own soul, and the theatres understood this perfectly. They were not selling you a film, they were selling you a break from being you. They were selling darkness and cold air and a soft seat and a couple of hours where nobody expected anything from you and nothing was your fault. For a country running on fumes and worry, that was not entertainment. That was survival dressed up in velvet. There was also the simple magic of leaving your own 4 walls. When money is tight, the world shrinks down to the size of your kitchen, and you start to feel like a coin rattling around in an empty jar. Walking out that door, joining a crowd, sitting shoulder to shoulder with people who were all just as tired and just as scared, reminded you that you were part of something larger than your own bad luck. So no, going to the pictures when you could barely afford dinner was not foolish. It was the sanest thing a person could do. You were spending your last quarter to remember that you were still alive, still dreaming, and still capable of laughing in the dark. And honestly, for 2 hours of not being afraid, a quarter was a steal. Before you go anywhere, you get dressed, and not in the way you get dressed today to go to the movies, which is basically pajamas with ambition. Going to the pictures in 1936 was an occasion. You put on your good coat, your cleaner shirt, and the hat you saved for church and funerals. Women set their hair and found their one nice pair of gloves. It did not matter that you were about to sit in total darkness where nobody could see you. You were entering a palace, and you dressed like it, even if that palace was 3 blocks from a soup line. Let us talk about your wardrobe situation, because it is grim. Most working people in this era owned a shockingly small number of outfits. There were your work clothes, worn thin and patched at the elbows, and then there were your good clothes, the ones you kept for anything that mattered. That was often the entire collection. No overflowing closet, no drawer of options, just the everyday and the special, with a hard line between them. And going out tonight, you cross that line. You reach for the special. For the men, this meant a suit if you had one, or at least a jacket, a collared shirt buttoned to the top, and shoes shined up with whatever you had on hand, which might have been actual polish, or might have been a little spit and a rag. The hat was not optional. A grown man walked out the door with something on his head, full stop, and taking it off indoors was a whole quiet language of manners you were expected to speak fluently. For the women, it was a real production. You pressed your best dress the night before, pinning and setting your hair into careful waves, which took time and patience and no small amount of suffering. You found your gloves, you found your good handbag if you had one, and you did your face with the small amount of makeup you rationed carefully because it had to last. The goal was to look like the women you were about to see up on the screen, or at least to nod in their direction. Now here is the part that makes a modern brain short-circuit. You were doing all of this to go sit in a pitch-black room. Nobody in that auditorium was going to admire your waved hair or your shined shoes, because the whole point of the room was that you could not see anything except the screen. It is a bit like ironing your shirt to go to sleep, and yet it made perfect sense to them, because getting dressed was not about being seen inside the theatre. It was about the ritual of the whole evening. Dressing up was how you told yourself that tonight was different. It was how you drew a bright line between your grinding, exhausting daily life and this small pocket of glamour you were about to step into. When you put on your good coat, You were not just covering your body. You were shrugging off the factory, the worry, the bills, the whole heavy costume of your ordinary self, and putting on the version of you that deserved marble floors and a ceiling full of stars. And there was pride in it too. You might be poor, but you were not going to walk into a grand palace looking like the times had beaten you. You were going to walk in with your chin up and your shoes gleaming, one of the beautiful people for a night. So you checked yourself over one last time in a cracked mirror, straightened that hat, and headed for the door looking sharp enough for royalty, which, for 1/4, is exactly what you were about to become. Now you step out into the evening and walk, because a car is a distant dream and a bus costs money you would rather spend on the show. The streets are darker than you would like. The shop windows are full of things nobody can buy, and every few blocks there is a reminder that times are hard. But then you turn the corner, and there it is at the end of the street, blazing away like somebody built a chunk of paradise on the sidewalk. The marquee pulls you in like a moth. You pick up your pace without even meaning to. The walk itself is a journey through the reality you're trying to escape. You pass the shuttered store that used to be the butcher, its windows soaped over now, a for rent sign curling in the corner. You pass a man sitting on a stoop who nods at you, and you nod back, and neither of you says the obvious thing about how thin everybody has gotten. The air smells like cold smoke and cold stone. Somewhere a radio is playing through an open window, tinny and far away, singing about better days that never quite seem to show up. Your good shoes were not built for distance, and you feel every crack in the pavement through the worn soles. But you do not mind, because walking is free, and free is the only budget you can afford tonight. This was simply how people moved through the world. Your legs were the family car, and they ran on stubbornness and cheap dinners. A walk of a mile or two to get somewhere you wanted to be was nothing worth complaining about. You bundled your coat tighter, tucked your chin down, and went. There is a strange comfort in the streets at this hour. The workday is done, and other people are out too, all of them heading somewhere, and you start to notice that a lot of them are drifting in the same direction as you. A couple ahead of you, arm in arm, a cluster of young people laughing about something. An older woman moving carefully in her Sunday best. You are all migrating toward the same glow like it is campfire on a cold night, and in a way, it is. Compare it to today, when getting to the movies means climbing into a warm car, arguing about parking, and staring at your phone the entire way there. Back then, the trip was part of the show. The anticipation built with every block. You could not fast forward it or scroll through it. You just walked toward the light, and the closer you got, the more the ordinary world fell away behind you. And that light was really something. Long before you could read a single word on the marquee, you could see the halo it threw against the night sky. A warm electric smudge glowing over the rooftops. It acted like a lighthouse for the broken, the weary, calling everyone in from the dark. In a neighbourhood where half the street lamps were dim and half the windows were dark to save on the electric bill, the theatre burned like it had never heard of a budget. By the time you reach the end of the block, you're practically hurrying. The building rises up in front of you, all lit up and impossibly grand, and the little knot of worry you have been carrying all day begins at last to loosen. You made it. You are here. The whole tired world is still standing right behind you, but you are about to walk straight through a wall of light and leave it on the sidewalk. And it will wait. The depression is very patient. It will be right there when you come out. Up close, the theatre is almost offensively grand. This is the age of the great movie palaces, buildings designed to make a factory worker feel like visiting royalty. Towering vertical signs, thousands of light bulbs, gold leaf smeared on everything that would hold still. The whole point was contrast. You spent your day in a grey, worried, penny-pinching world, and then you walk through a set of brass doors into a fever dream of chandeliers and velvet. It was escapism before the movie even started rolling. Stand back and take it in for a moment, because this thing is enormous. The picture palaces of this era were some of the largest and most lavish buildings a normal person would ever set foot in. We are talking about theatres that seated 2, 3, sometimes over 5,000 people, with facades that climbed several stories into the sky. In a lot of towns, the movie palace was hands down the fanciest structure for miles, grander than the bank, grander than the courthouse, grander than anywhere you would otherwise be allowed to loiter for a couple of hours. And the styles they built them in were completely unhinged in the best possible way. One theatre might be dressed up like an Egyptian temple, with painted pharaohs and lotus columns. Another might pretend to be a Spanish courtyard, or a French opera house, or a Chinese pagoda, or some wild soup of all of them at once that no self-respecting architect would admit to in daylight. Nobody was going for historical accuracy. They were going for the feeling of walking into somewhere far, far away from your actual life, and on that count they succeeded wildly. The lights alone were a spectacle. The front of the building would be studded with thousands of bulbs, chasing and flashing and spelling out the name of the theatre in letters you could read from blocks away. In the middle of a decade when a lot of families were rationing their own electricity down to a single bare bulb per room, the theatre burned brighter than a small city. It was a gorgeous, shameless, almost rude amount of light, and it was all pointed at one message, which was come inside and forget your troubles. It is a bit like the way a casino works on your brain today, honestly. Everything about the exterior was engineered to overwhelm you, to make you feel like the rules of your ordinary stingy existence did not apply the moment you crossed the threshold. Out here, you counted every penny. In there, you were about to be treated like a duke. The building was not just a container for movies. The building was the first act of the show, and the genius of it was the contrast, because contrast was the whole product. If life had been comfortable and easy, a chandelier would have been nice but forgettable. But life was hard and grey and frightening, and so stepping into all that gold and glow hit you like a physical thing. The grander the palace, the deeper the escape, and the people who built these places understood that math right down to the last light bulb. So you stand there for just a second on the sidewalk, a tired, broke, ordinary person in your one good coat, looking up at a building that seems to have been dropped in from a dream. Behind you is the depression, patient and grey. In front of you is a wall of light and velvet and impossible promises. You take a breath, square your shoulders, and step toward the brass doors. Tonight, at least, you get to live somewhere beautiful. Even if the lease is only good for 2 hours, your first stop is the little glass booth out front, glowing like a fish tank, with a bored cashier inside taking coins through a slot. Tickets ran anywhere from a nickel for a child up to a quarter for an adult evening show, with a dime being the sweet spot for most working folks. 25 cents does not sound like freedom until you remember what a quarter was worth in 1936. That was real money. That was a decision. And you handed it over gladly, because you were not buying a ticket. You were buying a few hours of not thinking about the rent. Let us put that quarter in perspective, because the number is meaningless without the world around it. In this decade, a loaf of bread might cost you the better part of a dime. A gallon of gasoline was around a dime as well, if you were one of the lucky few with a car to put it in. A man doing hard labour might bring home only a few dollars for an entire day, if he could find the work at all, so that 25 cents was not spare change rattling in your pocket. It was a genuine slice of the family budget, weighed and considered and reluctantly surrendered, which is exactly why the theatres worked so hard on their pricing. They knew their audience was hurting, so they built a ladder of options to catch every kind of customer. The afternoon matinee was cheaper than the evening show, so if you had time in the day you could get your fantasy at a discount. Children got in for a nickel, which is how a parent could unload the kids for the afternoon for less than the cost of a snack, and the balcony, or the cheaper seats down front where you had to crane your neck, cost less than the plush middle rows. There was a price for every wallet, and every wallet was thin. The cashier in that glowing booth had seen it all. She watched people count out their coins slowly, one at a time, doing the arithmetic in their heads about whether they could really spare it. She watched couples on a first date trying to look casual about money that was clearly tight. She watched kids press their noses to the glass and beg. All night long, hands slid coins under the window, and paper tickets slid back out, and each exchange was somebody making the small, brave decision to spend on joy instead of on fear. There is something almost sacred about handing over that quarter. It is a tiny act of defiance against everything the times were telling you. The whole world was screaming at you to hoard, to save, to be afraid, to expect the worst. And you looked all of that in the eye and said, "Not tonight. Tonight I am buying 2 hours of somewhere else." It is the same feeling you get today when you know you should be sensible and you buy the concert ticket anyway, because you cannot eat sensibility and you cannot dream on a savings account. And the return on that quarter was frankly ludicrous. For that single coin you did not get one movie. You got 2 features, a newsreel, a cartoon, a serial, a comedy short, maybe a live organ performance, and a few hours in a cooled, gilded palace with a ceiling full of stars. Pound for pound, penny for penny, it may be the greatest entertainment bargain in the history of the country. The studios were not being generous. They were being smart because a desperate public will always find one more coin for hope. So the ticket disappears into your palm, warm and a little flimsy, and you step toward the doors. You have made your trade. You gave up a quarter of your grocery money, and in return you get to stop being poor and scared for a while. On the balance sheet of the human heart, that was the best deal in town. Push through the doors, and you are immediately met by a teenager dressed like a foreign general. Ushers in the big theatres wore full uniforms, brass buttons, epaulettes, sometimes little pillbox hats, and they carried flashlights like they were guarding a national treasure. Their job was to seat you in the dark without letting you break your neck, and to keep order among a crowd of overexcited humans who'd paid good money to sit down. They took it deadly seriously. Getting sassed by a 15-year-old in a marching band costume was simply part of the experience. These uniforms were no joke either. The management of a great palace wanted every single detail to say luxury, and that included the staff. So they dressed their ushers in outfits that would not have looked out of place on the doorman of a grand hotel or, frankly, on a minor European prince. Sharp jackets with rows of gleaming buttons, crisp trousers with a stripe down the side, white gloves in the fanciest houses, and a hat that made a skinny local kid stand up a little straighter. The effect was to make you feel like you had arrived somewhere important, escorted by an honour guard. And for the kids wearing them, this was a serious job in a decade with almost no jobs to go around. Being an usher meant steady pay, a warm building, and a uniform that made you somebody. So these young men and women guarded their positions fiercely and performed their duties with the gravity of a soldier on parade. They stood at attention. They gave crisp directions. They walked you to your row with the solemn focus of someone defusing a bomb. It was a little bit silly and completely wonderful. Their most important tool was the flashlight, and watching a good usher work, it was a small art form. The auditorium was pitch dark, full of people, with a giant story playing out on the screen that nobody wanted blocked or interrupted. So the usher would appear at your side like a helpful ghost, tilt that beam down toward the floor, and lead you along the aisle in a soft pool of light, careful never to swing it up toward the screen and ruin the picture for everyone. You followed that little circle of light like a duckling following its mother. They were also the law. With a couple thousand people packed into one room, many of them children hopped up on candy somebody had to keep order, and that somebody was a teenager with a flashlight and an attitude. If you talked too loud, an usher materialized. If you put your feet on the seat, an usher materialized. If a couple of boys started throwing popcorn, an usher swooped in and separated them with the authority of a general breaking up a border dispute. And the strange thing is, it worked, because that uniform carried real weight. It is a bit like the way a flight attendant runs a cabin today, honestly. Here is a person, often young, in a sharp uniform, whose entire job is to make a big crowd of restless strangers behave, stay safe, and feel taken care of, all at the same time. You might grumble about being told to lower your voice, but deep down you were glad somebody was in charge, because it meant the evening would run smoothly and nobody would kick the back of your seat for 2 straight hours, so you let the young general lead you into the darkness, following that bobbing circle of light, feeling oddly honoured to be guided so carefully to a seat you could have found yourself. It was all part of the illusion, the constant gentle message that tonight you mattered, tonight you were a guest of quality, tonight you would be looked after. Not bad service for a quarter, and if the kid in the epaulets gave you a little attitude on the way in, well, you tipped your hat and forgave him. He had a national treasure to guard. Then you hit the lobby, and this is where your jaw does the thing where it slowly drops. Marble floors, sweeping staircases, oil paintings, mirrors framed in gold, and a ceiling so high you could lose a kite up there. Some theatres had fountains, some had live goldfish, some had actual imported statues that the owner almost certainly could not identify. None of it was subtle, and that was the entire point. For the price of a sandwich, you got to stand in a room that looked like a European king's hallway and pretend just for tonight that this was your life. Take a slow lap around this place because it deserves it. The floors are real stone, polished to a shine, cool and hard under your worn shoes. Grand staircases curve up toward the balcony, carpeted in deep red, with brass railings you're almost afraid to touch in case someone tells you not to. Overhead hang chandeliers dripping with crystal, throwing sparkles across a ceiling painted with clouds, or angels, or swirling gold patterns that draw your eye up and up until you get a little dizzy. The decorators of these palaces were not aiming for tasteful, they were aiming for overwhelming. They wanted you to walk in off the hard grey street and be physically stunned by the abundance of it all, so they piled it on. Velvet drapes as tall as a house, enormous urns full of flowers, real or otherwise, murals of gardens and gods and faraway lands stretching across the walls, gold leaf on the columns, on the mouldings, on anything that stood still long enough to be gilded. It was maximalism as a public service. And here is the detail that gets me every time. Some of these lobbies had fountains bubbling away, and some had little pools stocked with actual live goldfish, swimming around in the middle of a movie theatre in the middle of the worst economy the country had ever seen. Somebody looked at a building full of desperate, broke Americans and thought, "You know what this needs? Decorative fish." And they were right, because it was so absurd, so unnecessary, so gloriously indulgent, that it made you feel like you had wandered into the private mansion of somebody impossibly rich. That was the whole trick, and it was aimed squarely at people who had nothing. In your real life, you counted every coin and mended every sock and never wasted a scrap of anything. And then you stepped into this lobby where wealth was splashed around like it grew on trees, and for a few minutes you got to soak in a feeling most of you would never otherwise touch. The feeling of surplus, the feeling of more than enough, the feeling of standing somewhere that existed purely to be beautiful. It is a bit like walking into the lobby of a 5-star hotel today when you are absolutely not a guest. You know you cannot afford a single night there. You know you're just passing through. But for the length of that lobby, with the soft music and the fresh flowers and the staff who treat you like you belong, you get to borrow the feeling of a richer life. The palaces sold that exact sensation to millions of people who needed it far more than any hotel guest ever did. So you linger. You run your hand along a cool marble column when you think nobody's looking. You climb a few steps of the grand staircase just to feel the plush carpet under your feet. You catch your own reflection in a gold-framed mirror, and for once, you look like you belong in a place like this, because tonight you do. The goldfish swim their little circles, the chandelier glitters, and a poor, tired person in a borrowed slice of splendour allows themselves, briefly, to feel rich. Then the bell rings for the show, and it is time to go be royalty in the dark. Now you enter the auditorium itself, and if you got lucky with your theatre, you look up and gasp. The fanciest picture houses were built as atmospheric theatres, designed so the ceiling looked like a deep blue evening sky, complete with twinkling electric stars and little machines that projected drifting clouds. The walls were painted to look like the courtyard of a Spanish villa or a Moorish garden. You were technically indoors, in a city, in the worst economy in a century, and you were sitting under a soft summer night in a country that did not exist. Somebody thought very hard about how to make you feel okay. Let us talk about this ceiling, because it is one of the great magic tricks of the whole era. An architect named for this style figured out that if you painted the ceiling a deep midnight blue and studded it with tiny lights, you could make an enclosed room feel like the open air at dusk. Then he added little projectors that threw soft, slow-moving clouds across that painted sky, so the stars seemed to peek out and hide again just like a real evening. You sat down in a chair, tilted your head back, and there it was, the whole night sky, indoors, on demand. The walls kept the illusion going. Instead of plain plaster, they were built and painted to look like the outer walls of some romantic building in a warm foreign land. There might be fake balconies, fake windows with fake vines trailing down, statues tucked into little alcoves, and rooftops silhouetted against that glowing artificial horizon. The idea was that you were not in a theatre at all. You were sitting in a peaceful garden courtyard in Spain or Italy or some dreamy nowhere on the most beautiful evening of the year, waiting for a story to begin. And the effect on a tired human being was profound. Remember where you actually were. Crammed into a loud, dirty, worried city in a decade that had stolen the future right out from under everyone, breathing coal smoke and counting pennies. Then you walked into this room, and the ceiling opened up into a warm summer night, and your whole nervous system just exhaled. Your eyes went soft, the knot in your shoulders loosened, Before a single frame of film had rolled, the building had already reached in and gently untied the worst of your day. It is a bit like those sleep apps people use now, honestly. The ones that play the sound of rain and show you a calm little scene to trick your frazzled brain into settling down. The atmospheric theatre was doing the exact same thing decades early, at enormous scale in plaster and paint and electric starlight. It understood something the whole country needed to hear, which is that sometimes a person just needs to look up at a peaceful sky, even a fake one, and remember that the world can still be beautiful. There is a real tenderness in it when you stop to think about it. Somebody, some architect and some crew of painters and electricians poured all of their skill into building a fake sky for strangers. They did it so that a mill worker and a widow and a nervous young couple and a pack of restless kids could all lie back for a couple of hours under the same gentle stars and feel, briefly, like everything was going to be all right. That is a strange and lovely thing to build for people you will never meet. So you settle into your seat, tip your head back, and let those little electric stars twinkle down at you, while a soft cloud drifts across the painted heavens. The city is gone. The depression is gone. The bills, the bread lines, the bad news from far away, all gone. Tucked somewhere outside these walls, there is only the warm dark, the murmur of the crowd, and a summer night that will never end and never existed. And honestly, for a few hours, that fake sky did more good than a real one. The real one, after all, had been raining on you all decade. And then you notice the temperature, and honestly, this might be the real reason half the crowd is here. Movie theatres were among the very first public buildings in America to have real air conditioning. And in the brutal summers before anyone had it at home, that was a miracle worth a dime all by itself. The theatres knew it too. They plastered signs out front showing icicles and snowflakes and the magic words "cooled by refrigeration." People did not always come for the film. Sometimes they came to sit in a cold, dark room and remember what it felt like to not be sweating through their only shirt. You have to understand just how miserable summer was for a normal person in this era. There was no cool air waiting at home. Your apartment was a hot box. The walls holding the day's heat long into the night, the single fan you might own just pushing the warm air around in slow, useless circles. You slept sticky and woke sticky. You worked in factories and kitchens and fields that turned into ovens by noon. Heat was not a minor annoyance. It was a heavy, inescapable fact of life that ground you down for months at a stretch. And then along came the picture palaces with a genuinely futuristic weapon. Real mechanical cooling, the kind that could take a room packed with thousands of sweating bodies and keep it crisp and comfortable and almost chilly. This was cutting-edge technology, expensive and complicated, and the theatres were among the very first places ordinary people could experience it. Stepping in from a blistering summer street into that wall of cool air was not just pleasant, it was shocking, it was borderline spiritual. The theatres understood exactly what they had, and they marketed it shamelessly. Out on the marquee, right alongside the names of the stars, they would advertise the cool air like it was the main attraction, because for a lot of people it was. Big painted signs covered in icicles and snowflakes and polar imagery, promising sweet refrigerated relief inside. In the dead of a heat wave, that promise pulled crowds in off the sidewalk faster than any movie ever could. Some folks bought a ticket, walked in, and pretty much just sat there breathing. It is a bit like the way a shopping mall works on a scorching day now. When you're not really there to buy anything, you just needed somewhere air-conditioned to exist for a while. Except back then it was rarer and more precious, because so few places had it. The theatre was not competing with your comfortable living room, because you did not have a comfortable living room. It was offering you an experience of physical relief that you could not get anywhere else in your life for the price of a ticket you were going to enjoy anyway. And the cold did something to the whole mood of the place. It made the darkness cozier. It gave you a reason to keep your good coat close, to settle deeper into the plush seat, to feel wrapped up and taken care of. There is a specific kind of contentment in being pleasantly cool while you know it is brutally hot just outside. A smug little animal comfort that human beings have always chased. The palaces bottled that feeling and sold it by the ticket, and business was very, very good. So you sink into your seat as that cool, clean air washes over you, drying the sweat on the back of your neck for the first time all day. Your body, which has been quietly fighting the heat for weeks, finally gets to stand down. Combine that with the soft dark, the painted stars, and the plush chair, and you're already halfway to bliss before the projector even warms up. In a decade that took so much away from so many, the theatres gave people one small perfect thing, which was a cold, dark, peaceful room to hide in, and on a 100-degree afternoon, that alone was worth every penny of the dime. Somewhere near the entrance is the candy counter, gleaming with boxes of sweets in bright paper. For a few pennies you could get chocolate, licorice, jujubes, or whatever the local stand carried, and unwrapping it as quietly as humanly possible was a skill everyone pretended to have, and nobody actually did. Candy had been sneaking into theatres for years, often smuggled in against the rules until the owners realised there was gold in those little boxes. So they stopped fighting it and started selling it. Your sweet tooth quietly helped keep the whole industry alive. Here is a fun wrinkle of history for you. In the early days, the grand palaces did not want to sell candy at all. The owners of these gorgeous marble temples thought food was beneath them. They pictured wrappers on their fancy carpets and sticky fingers on their gilded railings, and they turned up their noses at the whole messy idea. Selling snacks was for cheap little Nickelodeons and sidewalk vendors, not for their cathedrals of cinema. So for a while, they simply banned it and pretended their audience did not eat. Their audience, of course, ate anyway. People are people, and people like a treat in the dark, so moviegoers just smuggled candy in themselves, tucked into pockets and purses and up sleeves. They bought it from the little shops and street vendors clustered around the theatre, then snuck it past the ushers with the guilty skill of a career criminal. For years there was this quiet standoff, the management pretending nobody was eating and the customers pretending right back, everyone crinkling wrappers in the dark and staring innocently at the screen. Then the Depression hit, and suddenly the theatres were desperate for every last cent of income they could scrape together. Some clever owner did the obvious math. People clearly wanted candy. People were clearly going to eat candy no matter what the rules said. So why on earth were they letting the vendor down the street pocket all that money instead of selling it themselves? The nose in the air came right back down, the counters went in, and just like that, the concession business was born inside the palace walls. And it turned out to be a lifesaver. This is one of the great open secrets of the movie business, then and now. The profit on the movie itself was thin, because a big chunk of your ticket money went back to the studios that made the film. But the candy the theatre bought cheap and sold for a tidy markup, that money stayed right in the owner's pocket. Those little boxes of sweets were quietly holding up the whole enterprise, keeping the lights on and the doors open through the leanest years. Now, actually eating your candy was its own adventure, because the boxes and wrappers of the day were engineered apparently for maximum noise. You would try to open your treat with the delicate care of a surgeon, easing the paper apart millimetre by millimetre, and it would still announce itself to the entire auditorium with a crackle like a small forest fire. Everyone did this. Everyone pretended they were being silent. Nobody was. The soundtrack of any movie in this era was dialogue, music, and the constant gentle rustle of 1,000 people losing a quiet battle with their candy. It is the same little ritual we still perform today, honestly. You still sneak the cheaper candy in from the drugstore because the prices inside are highway robbery. You still fumble with a wrapper in the dark and wince at how loud it is. You still feel that small, sweet flicker of joy when the chocolate hits while the story unfolds in front of you. Some things about sitting in the dark with a treat have not changed in nearly a century and probably never will. So you pick your poison off the gleaming counter, hand over a couple of precious pennies, and carry your little box of happiness toward your seat. It cost almost nothing. It will be gone in 20 minutes, and it will make the whole evening sweeter in a way that has nothing to do with sugar. And without you quite knowing it, that tiny purchase just helped keep the doors of the palace open for one more night. The mighty movie business, propped up by your sweet tooth. You cannot make this up. But the true hero of the concession stand was popcorn, and the Depression is the exact moment it took over the world. Popcorn was absurdly cheap to make, and absurdly profitable to sell, which made it the perfect food for a decade when nobody had a spare cent. At first, the fancy palaces turned their noses up at it, thinking it was too messy and too lowbrow for their marble floors. Then they saw the money the sidewalk popcorn vendors were making off their customers, did some quick math, and dragged those popping machines right into the lobby. The smell alone probably sold more tickets than any movie star. Popcorn was the perfect Depression food, and it is worth pausing on why. The raw kernels cost almost nothing. A single sack of corn could be turned into a mountain of the stuff, and each little bag you sold cost you pennies to make and returned a fat markup. In an era when every business was clinging to survival by its fingernails, popcorn was less a snack and more a small money printing operation that happened to smell delicious. For the customer, it was the cheapest treat around, and for the owner it was pure profit. Everybody won, but the palaces did not welcome it right away. Oh no. In the early years, the grand theatres considered popcorn hopelessly common, the food of carnivals and circuses and street corners, not of their gilded halls. They worried about greasy hands on the velvet and crushed kernels ground into the imported carpet. So they held the line and kept it out, while just beyond their doors, enterprising vendors set up popping carts on the sidewalk and did a roaring business selling to the very people walking in and out of the theatre. The vendors understood the location was gold. Park a popcorn cart right outside a building that dumps a few thousand hungry people onto the pavement every night, and you have got yourself a fortune in the making. These street sellers were quietly getting rich off the theatre's own crowds, and eventually the owners noticed the money walking right past their box office and into somebody else's pocket. That was a wound no Depression-era businessman could stand to bear. Something had to change, and change it did. One by one, the palaces surrendered, hauling popping machines into their lobbies and claiming that river of profit for themselves. Once they did, there was no going back. Popcorn became so central to the business that the theatres practically ran on it, and a whole strategy grew up around it. Keep the popcorn salty and people get thirsty. Sell them a drink. Keep the smell wafting through the lobby, and people who came in for the movie leave with a snack they never planned to buy. The Colonel quietly became king. That smell, by the way, was the secret weapon, and it still is today. There is something about the warm, buttery, toasty aroma of fresh popcorn that hooks straight into the animal part of your brain and starts your mouth watering before you've made any kind of decision. The theatres figured this out fast and made sure that smell drifted everywhere, out into the lobby, out toward the doors, sometimes out onto the street itself. It was advertising you could not see and could not resist, and it pulled coins out of pockets all night long. So you join the crowd drifting toward that irresistible smell, hand over a few pennies, and take your warm little bag into the dark. It is salty, it is satisfying, it costs almost nothing, and it makes you thirsty enough to buy a drink you did not know you wanted, which was the plan all along. You're not just enjoying a snack, you're taking part in a tiny economic revolution that helped an entire industry survive its darkest decade. Not bad for a bag of exploded corn. The movie stars got the fame, but the popcorn quietly paid the bills. Now comes the ancient human trial of finding a seat once the lights are already down. You shuffle in behind the beam of an usher's flashlight, apologising to a row of shadowy strangers as you crush their feet one by one. The theatres were enormous, often seating 2,000 or 3,000 people, so there was always a seat somewhere. The trouble was getting to it without landing in a lap or knocking somebody's precious popcorn into the abyss. You lower yourself down, exhale, and finally look up at the screen, which is roughly the size of a barn. The scale of these rooms is the first thing to wrap your head around. We're not talking about a cosy little screening room with a few dozen chairs. We're talking about cavernous halls with row after row after row of seats marching back into the darkness, balconies stacked overhead, and a ceiling somewhere far above. Filling a room like that meant a real crowd, hundreds and hundreds of people, all of them settling in around you in the gloom. Finding your particular empty seat among all of that was a genuine expedition, and you were doing it in near total darkness, because unlike today, people did not always arrive before the show started. The programs ran continuously, one long loop of newsreel and cartoon and feature and short playing over and over throughout the day. So you simply walked in whenever you happened to arrive, which was often smack in the middle of something already rolling. That meant stepping straight from a dim lobby into a pitch-black auditorium with a movie already playing and every eye already glued to the screen. This is where the usher earned that fancy uniform. Out of the dark, your young general would appear at your elbow, tilt the flashlight down toward the floor, and lead you along the aisle in a small bobbing pool of light. You followed close behind, watching your feet, trying not to trip on the sloped floor or the edge of a step. The usher scanned the rows for a gap, found you a spot, and gestured you in with the quiet efficiency of someone who did this 100 times a night. Then came the hard part, the shuffle down the row. You had to sidestep past a whole line of people already seated, all of them leaning back to let you by while very much not wanting to. You mumbled apologies into the dark. You stepped on a foot, then another foot, then somehow the same first foot again. You bumped a knee. You felt a bag of popcorn shift dangerously somewhere near your ankle, and prayed you had not just kicked somebody's snack into oblivion. It was a slow, awkward, whispered little journey, and everyone had to do it. It is exactly the same misery we all know today, honestly. You still arrive late, you still creep down a dark row, you still perform that hunched-over apologetic waddle past a line of annoyed strangers who paid to relax and are now being climbed over like a fence. Nearly a century of technology, and we still have not solved the fundamental problem of getting one human body to an empty seat past a row of other human bodies in the dark. Some struggles are simply eternal. But finally, blessedly, you reach your spot. You turn, you lower yourself down into the plush seat, and you let out the breath you have been holding since the lobby. The chair is soft, the air is cool, the darkness wraps around you, and up ahead the screen glows enormous, taller and wider than anything in your ordinary life. Whatever chaos you caused getting here is instantly forgotten. You made it. You are in. And now, at last, you can tip your head back, forget the world, and let the giant flickering picture pull you all the way in. Take a deep breath and enjoy that crisp refrigerated air, because it is absolutely full of cigarette smoke. People smoked in theatres constantly, sometimes in designated sections, often just wherever they happened to be sitting, and the projector beam cutting through that hazy blue cloud is one of the defining images of the era. Nobody thought a thing of it. You watched a 2-hour film through a gentle fog of tobacco, went home smelling like an ashtray, and considered it a perfectly lovely evening out. You have to remember that in this era, smoking was not a habit. It was practically a personality trait for a huge chunk of the population. People smoked everywhere and all the time. They smoked at their desks, in restaurants, on trains, in hospitals, in doctors' offices, and yes, in the movie theatre. It was woven so deeply into daily life that a room full of smoke was simply what a room full of people looked like. The idea that you might ask someone to put out a cigarette would have struck them as bizarrely rude. So the auditorium filled up with a soft haze that thickened as the evening went on. Some of the grander theatres made a gesture toward organisation, setting aside a smoking section, often up in the balcony or off to one side, as if the smoke had agreed to stay politely in its lane. It had not. Smoke does what smoke does, which is drift lazily everywhere, so the whole cavernous room slowly turned into one big gentle cloud, regardless of which section had the official blessing. And here is the strange and beautiful part. That haze actually became part of the magic of the picture show. When the projector fired its beam across the room toward the screen, that thick shaft of light caught every particle of smoke and lit it up. So the beam itself became visible, a solid, glowing river of light cutting through the dark overhead. You could look up and watch the story travel across the room in that shimmering column. It is one of the most iconic images of old movie-going, and it existed entirely because everyone was puffing away like a chimney. Your poor lungs, of course, did not sign up for this. Sitting for 4 or 5 hours in a sealed, cooled, packed room full of smokers meant you were marinating in tobacco whether you smoked or not. You walked in fresh and walked out with the smell soaked into your good coat, your hat, your carefully set hair, everything. You would be smelling that evening on your clothes for days, and nobody blinked, because everybody smelled like that all the time. Nose blindness was practically the national condition. It is genuinely hard for a modern person to picture, honestly. Today, the mere sight of someone lighting up in a theatre would cause an uproar and probably an escort out the door. The whole notion of clean, smoke-free public air is so normal to us now that the old reality feels like another planet. But for your grandparents, a movie without a comfortable fog drifting through the beam would have felt oddly empty, like something was missing from the atmosphere they'd always known. So you settle back into your cool seat, the giant screen glowing ahead of you, and you breathe in that soft blue haze along with everyone else, not thinking a thing of it. Overhead, the projector beam cuts its glowing path through the smoke, carrying the story across the room like a river of light. It is beautiful in a way, even if it is quietly wrecking every lung in the building. You will smell like an ashtray tomorrow, and you will not care one bit, because tonight you are sitting in a palace watching a dream, wrapped in the fog of a decade that smoked its worries away one cigarette at a time. Before the pictures even start, you might get a live show, because the palaces did not just fling a movie at you and call it a night. Many had a giant theatre organ, a mighty instrument with more pipes than a small church, that rose up out of the floor while an organist played you into the mood. Some houses had full stage shows, singers, dancers, comedians, a little vaudeville appetizer before the main course. You were getting a genuinely absurd amount of entertainment for your quarter, which was the whole strategy. Give the poor, exhausted public everything, and they will always find one more coin. Let us start with that organ, because it was a marvel. This was no modest little instrument tucked in a corner. It was an enormous machine, its pipes hidden throughout the building, capable of filling the entire cavernous hall with sound. And the truly wild part was that a single organist, working a keyboard bristling with switches and pedals, could make it do almost anything. It could roar like a full orchestra one moment and coo like a flute the next. It could imitate drums, bells, horns, and a startling range of sound effects, all from one person perched at the console. The entrance of the organ was a show all by itself. In the fancier houses, the whole console would rise slowly up out of the floor on a lift, the organist already playing, bathed in a spotlight as the crowd applauded. It was pure theatre, a grand flourish designed to make you feel like the evening was building towards something special. The music would swell through the room, warm and enormous, and you could feel the deeper notes vibrating right up through the floor and into your chest. These instruments had come up through the silent film years, when live music was not a bonus but a necessity, because the films themselves made no sound. An organist or a small orchestra would play along with the picture, following the action, swelling for the romance and thundering for the chase. By the time you're sitting here in the middle of the 1930s, the films can talk and sing on their own, but the organ has stuck around as a beloved warm-up act, a bridge between the lobby and the story. And in the biggest palaces, the organ was just the beginning. Some houses put on entire live stage shows before the movie, a whole variety program of the kind of acts that used to fill the vaudeville circuits. You might get a line of dancers, a crooner in a sharp suit, a comedian rattling off jokes, an acrobat, a magician, whatever talent the theatre could book that week. It was a full evening of live entertainment stacked right on top of a full evening of film, all rolled into that one small ticket price. Think about the sheer value being handed to you here. Today you pay a small fortune for a single movie, and that is all you get, one film and then out you go. But in the palace, your quarter bought you a live musical performance, possibly a whole stage show with singers and dancers, and then the entire film program on top of it. It is a bit like buying a concert ticket and having them throw in a couple of movies afterward for free. The generosity was almost aggressive, and it was entirely on purpose, because the whole business model rested on giving a struggling public more than they could possibly expect. If the theatre overwhelmed you with entertainment, if it packed your evenings so full that you staggered out amazed at what a single coin had bought, then you would be back next week, and the week after that, coin in hand. So you sat there in the dark as the mighty organ rose up playing, the sound rolling over you like a warm wave, and you felt for a moment like the richest person alive. All that music, all that spectacle, all for you. The palace was not just showing movies, it was putting on a feast. The lights dim for real now, and the first thing on that giant screen is not the movie, it is the newsreel. Before television existed, this was how ordinary Americans actually saw the news with their own eyes, instead of just reading it or hearing it on the radio. A booming narrator, dramatic music, and moving pictures of everything from sporting events to floods to world leaders shaking hands. You leaned forward for this. This was your window onto a planet you would otherwise never see. You have to appreciate how starved for images the world was back then. There was no television glowing in the corner of your living room, no phone in your pocket streaming footage from across the globe. If something big happened far away, you read about it in the newspaper, in cold black print, or you heard a voice describe it on the radio, but you did not see it. You did not watch it move. So the newsreel was something close to miraculous, a way to actually witness the wider world in motion, right there on the screen. The format was unmistakable. A dramatic fanfare of music, a bold title card, and then that voice, the booming, confident, larger-than-life narrator who described every scene with breathless importance. Whether it was a hurricane or a horse race, that voice made it sound like the most thrilling event in human history. Between the segments, there was a rhythm to it, a fast-paced parade of stories from around the country and around the globe, each one just long enough to hook you before moving on to the next. And the range of what they showed was enormous. One moment you might be watching a championship boxing match, the next a natural disaster somewhere far off, then a parade, then a strange new invention, then a world leader waving from the steps of some grand building. There were human interest oddities, little bits of spectacle, and the occasional light-hearted piece to balance out the heavy news. It was the whole planet, chopped into bite-sized pieces and beamed onto a wall for a crowd of small-town Americans who might never travel more than a few counties from home. For those people, this was genuinely their eyes on the world. A farmer in a quiet valley, a factory worker in a grey city, a family who had never once left their home state. All of them got to see distant lands and famous faces and world-shaking events with their own eyes, in the dark, for the price they had already paid. It collapsed the enormous distances of the era, if only for a few minutes, and made the whole wide world feel a little closer and a little more real. It is a bit like scrolling a feed of news clips on your phone today, honestly, except you got it once a week in a crowd instead of every 10 seconds alone, and there was a strange power in watching it together. When the whole auditorium gasped at a disaster or cheered at a triumph or laughed at some bit of nonsense, you felt yourself part of something, a shared national moment, everyone in that dark room reacting to the same images at the same time. The news was not private and endless the way it is now. It was communal, and it was an event. So you leaned in as the fanfare played and the title card flashed, ready to see the world. The narrator's voice boomed out, the images flickered to life, and for a few minutes you travelled everywhere, witnessing the pieces of a planet you would otherwise only ever imagine. It was informative, it was thrilling, it was a genuine wonder of the age. And then, as the newsreel rolled on through its parade of stories, it began to show you some things from far across the ocean that were not so easy to cheer about at all. And what you saw in those newsreels in the middle of the 1930s was not exactly soothing. There were floods and dust storms at home, bread lines and strikes, and from across the ocean the unmistakable sound of things going very wrong. Strange new leaders were shouting into microphones in front of enormous crowds in Europe. Armies were on the move. You sat there in your cozy velvet seat halfway through your popcorn, watching the first quiet warnings of a storm that had not fully broken yet. Then the narrator wrapped up, the music swelled, and mercifully it was time for a cartoon. Close to home the news was hard enough. The newsreel might show you images of the great dust storms rolling across the plains, walls of dirt swallowing farms and homes whole, families loading everything they owned onto trucks and fleeing land that had turned to powder. It might show you floods drowning towns, or long lines of hollow-eyed people waiting for a bowl of soup, or workers clashing with police outside a shuttered factory. This was your own country, hurting, and there it was on the giant screen for everyone to see. But it was the news from across the ocean that carried a colder kind of weight, even if most people watching could not yet name exactly why. The camera would show enormous rallies in Europe, seas of people packed into squares, and up on a platform a single figure shouting into a microphone, his arms slashing the air, the crowd roaring back in a way that made the hair on your neck stand up. You did not need to understand the language to feel that something enormous and dangerous was gathering itself over there. There were armies too in these glimpses, rows and rows of soldiers marching in perfect step, machines of war rolling past reviewing stands, new weapons being shown off with obvious pride. It all had a sheen of order and power to it, polished and impressive on the surface. But underneath there was a menace you could feel in your gut. The narrator would describe it in that same booming voice he used for boxing matches and parades, and yet the pictures themselves whispered a warning that the cheerful tone could not quite cover. Sitting there in your safe, cool, gilded palace, it must have been a deeply strange feeling. Here you were, an ocean away, wrapped in velvet and darkness, halfway through a bag of popcorn, watching the earliest tremors of something that would one day reach across that ocean and change everything. Nobody in that theatre knew the full shape of what was coming. They only knew, in a vague and uneasy way, that the world outside their little town was growing more frightening by the week, and that the bad news kept arriving. It is a bit like the way we all doom-scroll now, honestly, that low hum of dread you get watching distant crises unfold on a screen while you sit somewhere warm and safe and slightly helpless. You cannot look away, but you cannot do anything about it either, so it just settles into you as a quiet background worry. The difference is that your grandparents got their dread once a week, in a crowd, in the dark, and then blessedly, the programme moved on to something kinder. 'Cause that was the genius of the whole evening, really. The newsreel gave you the world, the good and the terrible both, and then it stepped aside and let something wonderful wash the worry away. Just as the weight of it all started to press down on your chest, just as the images from that nervous gathering world began to sink in, the heavy music faded, the screen changed, and a bright, silly, harmless little cartoon leapt to life in front of you. The palace knew exactly what it was doing. It showed you the storm, and then it handed you an umbrella made of laughter. Nothing washed the worry out of your brain faster than the cartoon, and this was a golden moment for them. A little animated short would light up the screen with a mouse, a duck, a rabbit, or a very bendy character getting into trouble set to music. Colour was creeping in, sound was everywhere, and the artists were doing wild, gorgeous, inventive things nobody had ever seen move before. For 6 or 7 minutes, the entire theatre, grown adults included, laughed like children. It was ridiculous, it was beautiful, and it was exactly what a scared country needed. This was, without exaggeration, one of the great creative explosions in the history of the art form. Animation was still young, still figuring out what it could do, and the people making these shorts were bursting with ideas. Every week seemed to bring some new trick, some new gag, some new way of making drawings dance and stretch and squash and come alive. The characters bounced in perfect time to the music, the whole world of the cartoon rubbery and elastic and full of impossible energy. You had genuinely never seen anything like it, because nobody had. Sound had transformed everything. In the silent days, A cartoon was clever, but quiet. Now the characters could talk, sing, and most importantly, sync every single movement to a bouncing, jaunty musical score. A character would tiptoe to the beat, get bonked on the head with a perfectly timed cymbal crash, and go wobbling away as the music wobbled right along with them. This tight marriage of picture and sound was hypnotic and hilarious, and the audiences of the day ate it up completely. Colour was the newest wonder creeping in. Most of what you watched was still in black and white, but more and more of these shorts were bursting into rich, saturated colour, and the effect on a Depression-era audience was electric. To see a cartoon world painted in bright, cheerful hues glowing off the screen in a decade so full of grey and gloom was pure joy. The studios knew it too, and they poured real artistry and real money into these tiny films, treating a 7-minute cartoon like a small masterpiece. And the beautiful thing was how completely it disarmed everyone. This was not just entertainment for the children in the crowd. Grown men who'd spent the day worried sick about work and money, women carrying the weight of stretching nothing into dinner, tired people of every age, all of them melted the moment the cartoon began. The whole cavernous room, thousands of adults and kids together, would rock with laughter at a mouse outwitting a cat or a duck losing his temper. For a few minutes, everyone in the building was a delighted 7-year-old again. It is a bit like the way a silly video can reset your whole mood today. Honestly, that little burst of pure dumb joy that shakes the heaviness loose. Except this arrived on an enormous screen, in a crowd, right on the heels of all that frightening news from a nervous world. The timing was no accident. The palace showed you floods and dust storms and shouting men in far-off squares, and then, before the dread could take root, it handed you a cartoon and let the whole room laugh it off together. That was medicine, plain and simple. Laughter shared in a dark room with 1,000 strangers is a powerful thing, and for a country that had been kicked in the teeth by an entire decade, it was exactly the right prescription. So you sat there giggling helplessly at a bit of colourful nonsense, the worry of the newsreel already fading, your shoulders loose, your face aching from a grin you did not plan on. 6 or 7 glorious minutes of it, and then it was over, and you were left lighter, brighter, and ready for whatever the palace served up next. And what it served up next was designed to keep you coming back for more. Then came the serial, which was basically the streaming binge of its day, except cruelly rationed 1 chapter at a time. Each week you got a 15 or 20-minute installment of some ongoing adventure full of ray guns, jungles, masked villains, and heroes in capes. And every single episode ended with the hero dangling off a cliff or strapped to something about to explode. So you had no choice but to come back next week to find out how they survived. It was a shameless trick to get your dime again and again, and it worked flawlessly. You were hooked, and you knew it, and you did not care. The serial was pure escapist adventure, cranked out fast and cheap and thrilling. Each week's chapter dropped you back into an ongoing story, usually something wildly exciting and just a little ridiculous. There were square-jawed heroes and dastardly villains, damsels in peril and daring rescues, exotic jungles and futuristic cities and secret laboratories. Spaceships and ray guns rubbed shoulders with cowboys and detectives. It did not have to make perfect sense. It only had to move fast and end on a knife's edge. And it always did. That knife's edge was the whole point, and it had a name. The cliffhanger. Every single chapter built to a moment of maximum peril, and then simply stopped right there with the hero in mortal danger. He would be tied to the tracks as the train roared in, or plummeting toward the earth in a doomed aircraft, or trapped in a flooding room with the water at his chin. The music would swell, a title card would promise the thrilling conclusion next week, and the screen would move on, leaving you gasping and cheated and absolutely desperate to know what happened. And of course, you could not know what happened, not for 7 whole days. There was no way to skip ahead, no next episode waiting for you to click, no way to satisfy that itch except to come back to the theatre the following week and hand over your money again. This was the cruelest and most brilliant trick in the whole business. The serial did not just entertain you. It reached into your brain, planted a question you could not answer, and then made you pay to have it resolved, one agonizing week at a time. The genius was that it turned a one-time customer into a regular. If you got hooked on a serial, and you would, then you were not making a single decision to see a movie. You were signing up in your heart to return again and again until the story was done, which might be a dozen chapters or more. The theatre had transformed your idle curiosity into a standing appointment. Week after week, there you were, back in your seat, because you simply had to find out how the hero escaped that last impossible trap. It is exactly the same hook that streaming services sink into us today, honestly, and it is a little humbling to realise the trick is nearly a century old. That compulsion to see just one more episode, that inability to leave a story unfinished, that willingness to keep coming back to find out what happens next. Your grandparents felt all of it, sitting in the dark, gnawing their fingernails over whether the caped hero survived the exploding dam. The technology has changed completely. The trap it sets in the human brain has not changed at all. So you sat through your chapter on the edge of your seat, thrilled and delighted, and then the screen froze the hero mid-disaster and calmly told you to come back next week. You groaned. You grinned. You knew exactly what had just been done to you, and you knew with total certainty that you would be right back in this seat in 7 days to see it through. The serial had you, and you had made a quiet promise you fully intended to keep, which was, of course, the plan all along. You cannot make this up. Somewhere in the pile of entertainment there was almost always a comedy short, a quick blast of slapstick to keep the energy up. This was the age of grown men poking each other in the eyes, slipping on things and hitting one another with an entire hardware store's worth of tools, all for your amusement. The formula was simple. Take a few idiots, give them a task they are catastrophically unqualified for, and let the chaos build. You watched a man get a pie in the face in glorious detail and laughed until your ribs hurt, which was frankly a bargain at any price. Slapstick was the beating heart of the comedy short, and it was a beautifully dumb art form. There was very little in the way of clever plot. Instead, there was physical mayhem, escalating and relentless, a symphony of pratfalls and collisions and things going catastrophically wrong. Somebody would slip on something, somebody would get bonked on the head, somebody would back into a ladder, which would knock over a bucket, which would douse a third somebody, who would swing around in a rage and clout the first fellow all over again. On and on it went, faster and faster, until the whole thing collapsed into glorious ruin. The genius of it was in the timing and the escalation. A good comedy short did not just throw one gag at you and quit. It built. A small problem became a bigger problem, became a total disaster. Each mishap setting up the next, the pace quickening until the screen was pure pandemonium. The performers were often astonishing physical talents, taking real falls and real hits with the precision of athletes, making it look effortless and painless when it was surely neither. They suffered magnificently, and they suffered on purpose, all for the laugh. The setups were always the same reliable recipe, and that was the joy of it. You took a couple of hopeless characters and handed them a job they had absolutely no business attempting. They would try to hang a door, or paint a house, or run a restaurant, or fix a car, and their sheer incompetence would spiral into destruction. The comedy came from the certainty of it. You knew from the first moment that everything was going to go horribly wrong. The only question was how spectacularly, and the answer was always more than you expected. And there is a special kind of comfort in that predictability, especially in an uncertain time. Your real life in this decade was full of problems with no punchline, hardships that just ground on with no relief in sight. But here on the screen was chaos with a guaranteed payoff, disaster that existed purely to make you laugh, suffering that hurt nobody and delighted everybody. There was something deeply reassuring about watching a world fall apart when you knew for certain it was all in good fun and would tidy itself up by the end. It is the same simple pleasure that keeps a certain kind of comedy alive today, honestly. We still love watching people fail hilariously at things, still laugh at a well-timed pratfall, still delight in watching a small mistake snowball into total catastrophe. The pie in the face has survived nearly a century because it works on something basic and human in us. When the world is heavy, there is real relief in watching a fool walk into a rake, and there always will be. So the short would spin its way to its inevitable chaotic finish. The last bucket dumped, the last door collapsed, the last idiot flat on his back, and the whole auditorium would be roaring, wiping their eyes, ribs aching from laughing. It asked nothing of you. It taught you nothing. It simply picked you up and shook the gloom right out of you for a few glorious minutes. And in the middle of the hardest decade anyone could remember, a man getting a pie in the face was worth its weight in gold. A bargain at any price. Before the main event, the screen teased you with coming attractions, the fast, breathless previews of everything the theatre wanted you back for. A thundering voice promised the most thrilling, the most romantic, the most spectacular picture ever committed to film roughly once a week, forever. You sat there quietly building a mental list of which movies were worth another precious quarter. It was advertising, sure, but it was also a promise. There would be more. Next week and the week after, the palace would still be here, still glowing, still ready to take you somewhere better. The style of these previews was gloriously, shamelessly over the top. There was that voice again, the booming narrator. Except now he was not describing the news, he was selling you a dream. Every single picture was, according to him, the greatest achievement in the history of moving pictures. It was the most breathtaking, the most romantic, the most action-packed, the most unforgettable film ever made. And it was coming soon to this very theatre. He said this about a different movie every week, with the exact same total conviction, and somehow you believed him every time. The clips themselves were designed to grab you and not let go. Fast cuts of the most exciting moments, the biggest stars flashing their famous faces, snatches of thrilling action, and swooning romance, all stitched together to make your heart beat a little faster. Bold words would slam onto the screen between the scenes, shouting about passion and danger and spectacle. It was a fire hose of enticement, engineered to leave you wanting more, and it did its job on you every time whether you liked it or not. What it was really doing, of course, was planting seeds. As you sat there watching, you started quietly making decisions. That one looks worth seeing. That one I could skip. That one, with those 2 stars, I absolutely have to catch. Without quite meaning to, you were building a little schedule in your head, a list of reasons to come back and spend another hard-earned coin. The theatre was farming your desire week by week, teaching you to look forward to what was coming next. But there was something more than mere salesmanship in it, something that mattered in a decade like this one. The coming attractions were a promise about the future, and the future was exactly the thing the Depression had stolen from everyone. Out in the real world, nobody could count on anything. Jobs vanished, savings evaporated, plans crumbled. But here, in the dark, the screen made you a small, reliable promise. There would be more. Next week there would be a new picture. The palace would still be standing, still glowing, still ready to welcome you in. That is a quietly powerful thing to offer people who had learned to fear tomorrow. It gave you something to look forward to, a small fixed point of hope in an uncertain week, when so much of life had become a matter of just getting through the day. Having a reason to anticipate next Friday, a new adventure waiting on that giant screen, was a genuine comfort. The theatre was not just selling tickets, it was selling the reassurance that the future would arrive and that it would have something wonderful in it. It is the same feeling we chase now, honestly, when a trailer for something we're dying to see drops, and we mark the date in our minds and feel that little flicker of pleasant anticipation. That flicker is a gift, especially when the present is hard. Your grandparents felt it in the dark, watching that booming narrator promise them the most spectacular picture ever made, and holding on to the simple, steadying knowledge that they would be back to see it. So you filed your mental list away, settled a little deeper into your seat, and let the previews fade. The promises had been made, the future was booked, and now, at last, the main event was about to begin. Now here is where the Depression really shows its hand. Times were so hard and theatres were so desperate for your business that they started giving you 2 entire movies for the price of 1, back to back, and called it a double feature. 2 films, plus the cartoon, plus the serial, plus the newsreel, plus the short, all for a single ticket. You could walk in at 7 and stagger out near midnight, absolutely stuffed with entertainment, having gotten more hours of joy per penny than at any other point in human history. Value, my friend, was the whole business model. To understand why this happened, you have to understand how frightened the theatres were. When money is that tight across an entire country, people start cutting the movies from their budget, and that terrified the owners. So they went to war for your quarter, and their weapon was sheer, overwhelming quantity. If one movie was not enough to lure you out of your house, they reasoned, then 2 movies certainly would be. Give the public so much that staying home felt like a foolish waste, and the public would come, and come they did, because the math was irresistible. For the exact same coin you had always paid, you now got roughly twice the film. 2 full-length features, one after the other, with the whole supporting programme of cartoons and serials and newsreels wedged in and around them. Your single ticket bought you an entire evening, start to finish, hours upon hours of sitting in the cool dark being told stories. It was, pound for pound, the greatest entertainment bargain the country had ever seen, and it existed precisely because the country was on its knees. The shape of the evening became a kind of ritual. First the newsreel to show you the world, then a cartoon to make you laugh, then a serial to hook you for next week, then the first feature, then maybe a comedy short to reset the mood, and then the second feature to send you home. It was a full meal with courses, carefully arranged so that the energy rose and fell and rose again, never letting you get bored, never letting you feel like you had gotten anything less than everything. The result was that a trip to the pictures ate up your whole night, and there was a feature, not a bug. When you're poor and worried and the world outside is grim, hours are exactly what you want to buy. A cheap thrill that lasts 20 minutes leaves you back in your troubles too soon. But an evening that stretches from early supper time until nearly midnight, that keeps the darkness and the escape going and going, that is a genuine refuge. You are not just buying a movie. You are buying a long, safe, warm hiding place from your entire life. It is a bit like the way we binge a whole season in one sitting today, honestly. That pleasure of sinking into hour after hour of story and letting the real world wait. Except your grandparents did it in a crowd, in a palace, under a ceiling of painted stars with strangers laughing and gasping all around them. The instinct is the same. When life gets heavy, we want to disappear into stories for as long as we possibly can, and the double feature let you disappear for nearly the whole night. So you would settle in for the long haul, popcorn in hand, prepared to be entertained until you could barely keep your eyes open. 2 whole films and everything around them, all for a single quarter, in a cool, dark palace on a hard year. You would eventually stagger out into the midnight street, blinking and dazed and thoroughly satisfied, having gotten more joy from 1 coin than seemed possible. The times were brutal, but the value was unbeatable. Desperation, it turns out, made for a very generous business. The second film in that double feature had a name, and that name was the B Picture. These were the cheaper, faster, scrappier movies made on tight budgets to fill out the program, and they were exactly as glamorous as they sound. 60 minutes of a detective, a cowboy, or a monster, shot in a hurry with sets that occasionally wobbled if an actor leaned on them wrong. They were not going to win any awards, and everyone knew it. But they were pure, honest fun, and some of them were secretly better than the expensive picture they were propping up. The whole system worked on a clear division of labour. The big film, the A Picture, was the star of the show, the one with the famous faces and the lavish budget, and the name up in lights on the marquee. The B Picture was its humble little sidekick. The second feature slapped on to fill out the double bill and give you your money's worth. It was never meant to be great. It was meant to be there, to fill the time, to keep the program running long and satisfying for the price of 1 ticket. Because they were made on a shoestring and shot at breakneck speed, the B Pictures had a particular scrappy charm. The budgets were tiny, so the studios cut every corner they could find. Sets were reused from film to film, so you might recognize the same saloon or the same laboratory turning up in a dozen different movies. Costumes were borrowed. Scenes were shot in 1 quick take because there was no time or money for a second. And yes, if an actor leaned too hard on a wall, sometimes that wall gently reminded everyone that it was made of painted canvas and hope. The subjects were reliable and unpretentious. You got a lot of quick, punchy genre pictures, the kind that did not need a big budget to work. A detective chasing a killer through foggy streets. A cowboy riding into town to clean up trouble. A monster lurching around a shadowy castle. A gangster. A jungle adventure. A spooky old house. These were sturdy, familiar shapes, and the B Pictures cranked them out fast and cheap one after another, because the audience never tired of a solid, straightforward yarn told with a little energy. Nobody involved was under any illusions about what these films were. The studios knew, the theatres knew, and frankly you knew, settling in for the second feature, that you were not about to witness great art, and that was completely fine. The B Picture did not ask to be admired. It asked only to entertain you for an hour, to keep the evening rolling, to give you one more helping of story before you headed home. There is a real honesty in that, a lack of pretension that is almost refreshing. And here is the delightful secret. Sometimes the scrappy little B-picture was actually more fun than the expensive prestige film it was propping up. Freed from the pressure of being important, made fast and loose by people who just wanted to tell a good story quickly, these cheap films could be lively, weird, and wildly entertaining in ways the big serious pictures sometimes were not. Now and then you would walk out remembering the goofy monster movie far more fondly than the grand romance it had been paired with. The underdog stole the show. It is a bit like the way a low-budget guilty pleasure can outshine a bloated blockbuster today, honestly. Sometimes the thing made with more heart than money is simply more fun to watch. So you would sit through your B-picture with low expectations and an open mind, and more often than you would expect, it would surprise you, sending you home grinning about a wobbly set and a rubber monster and a hero who saved the day in under an hour. Cheap, cheerful, and secretly wonderful. Not every hero needs a big budget. At last, the main event. The big feature, the reason it says what it says on the marquee out front. And here is the thing your grandparents would want you to appreciate. This picture talked. The switch from silent films to talkies had only just finished sweeping through the country, and hearing actors actually speak, sing, and crack jokes still felt a little like magic. The lights are down, the music comes up, the title fills that enormous screen, and for the next 90 minutes the depression simply does not exist. There is only the story. You have to remember how recent and how enormous the arrival of sound had been. Just a handful of years earlier, all movies were silent. The actors moved and gestured. The story unfolded, but no voices came out. You read the dialogue on title cards and an organist filled the room with music. That was simply what movies were for the entire history of the art form up to that point. And then, almost overnight, that changed forever, and the whole world of film was reborn with a voice. The transition had been swift and total. Once audiences heard actors actually speak, there was no going back. The silent film, which had been the only kind of film anyone had ever known, was suddenly obsolete, swept aside in just a few short years. By the time you're sitting here in the middle of the 1930s, the talkies have completely taken over, and yet the novelty has not entirely worn off. There is still a thrill in it, still a small wonder in watching a face on a screen open its mouth and hear it speak. And what that sound unlocked was extraordinary. Now the movies could give you crackling dialogue, actors trading sharp, quick lines back and forth. They could give you songs, whole musical numbers with singers and orchestras filling the palace with sound. They could give you the roar of a crowd, the screech of tires, the boom of a storm, the whisper of a lover. An entire dimension of storytelling had opened up, and the filmmakers were still giddily exploring everything it could do. You were watching an art form in the full flush of a glorious new power. The moment the feature began was a small ceremony all its own. The lights would drop all the way down. The room would hush, or hush as much as a smoky candy-crunching crowd ever did. The music would swell up grand and full, and the title would appear on that enormous screen, letters as tall as a person, announcing the picture you had come to see. Something in your chest would lift. This was it. This was the thing itself, the reason for the whole beautiful evening. And then it took you away. For the length of that feature, 90 minutes or so, the world you actually lived in simply ceased to be. There was no rent, no breadline, no dust storm, no shouting men in far-off squares. There was only the story unfolding in front of you, enormous and vivid and completely absorbing. You forgot your seat, forgot the crowd, forgot your own tired body. You lived for a little while entirely inside somebody else's world, and it was a mercy beyond price. It is the same disappearing act we still crave today, honestly. That blessed feeling of a story so good you forget yourself entirely. But it landed differently on a people so battered by hard times. To sit in a cool, dark palace under painted stars and vanish utterly into a talking, singing, glorious dream for 90 minutes was not a small thing. It was the whole point, the treasure at the centre of the evening. So the title blazed, the music soared, and the depression quietly stepped outside to wait. For the next 90 minutes there was only the story, and you were happily, completely lost in it. And oh, the faces on that screen. This was the height of the studio star system, when a handful of impossibly glamorous men and women were manufactured, polished, and beamed into every small town in America. You did not just watch these people. You followed them. You read about them in fan magazines, you copied their hair, you argued about them with your friends. They lived lives of tuxedos and champagne and marble staircases, which was a spectacular thing to daydream about while you walked home to a cold apartment. The stars were not real exactly. That was the appeal. The star system was a machine, and it ran with astonishing precision. The great studios did not simply hire actors, they built stars from the ground up, like manufacturers building a product. They would take a promising young person, change their name to something more glamorous, fix their hair and teeth, coach their voice, teach them how to move and dress and smile, and then carefully craft a public image for them to inhabit. Nothing was left to chance. Every photograph, every story, every appearance was managed to keep that image gleaming. And then they beamed these polished creations out to the entire country, into every city and every tiny town, onto every palace screen from coast to coast. This was a shared national dream in a way that is hard to imagine now. Because there were only so many stars and everyone saw the same pictures, the whole country fell in love with the same faces at the same time. A farmer's daughter in a quiet valley and a shop clerk in a big city could sigh over the exact same leading man. The stars belonged to everyone. The devotion people felt was intense and personal. You did not just enjoy a star's movies. You followed their life, or the version of it the studios fed you, through a whole ecosystem of fan magazines that reported on their romances, their homes, their clothes, their every glamorous move. You copied their hairstyles and their fashions. You picked favourites and defended them fiercely, arguing with your friends about who was the finest actor or the greatest beauty. These distant, glittering people felt somehow like they belonged to you. Part of the magic was the sheer gap between their lives and yours. Up on that screen, the stars moved through a world of impossible luxury. Tuxedos and evening gowns, champagne and chandeliers, sweeping marble staircases and gleaming automobiles. They were never tired, never worried about money, never anything but polished and radiant. And you sat in the dark drinking it in, and then you walked home through the cold to your cramped rooms, carrying the memory of all that glamour like a warm coal in your pocket. That gap was not a flaw. It was the entire point. Nobody wanted to pay a quarter to watch people struggle with the rent because they had that at home for free. They wanted to watch beautiful people living beautifully, live so far above the daily grind that they became a kind of fairy tale. The unreality was the gift. The stars offered a dream of a life without hardship, and for a country buried in hardship, that dream was worth every coin. It is not so different from the way we follow famous faces today, honestly. That same mix of admiration and fascination and vicarious escape. But it was more concentrated then, more universal, more genuinely magical, because there was no other window onto that kind of glamour and everyone was looking through the same one. So you gazed up at those luminous faces larger than life on the enormous screen, and you let yourself dream of tuxedos and champagne and marble stairs. They were not quite real, those gleaming stars. But then, in a decade like that one, neither was the comfort they gave you, and you would not have traded it for anything. Most of what you watched was in crisp black and white, but by the middle of the decade something new was starting to bloom on the screen. Colour. Real, rich, saturated colour. So bright and so unnatural that the first time you saw it your whole body reacted. Studios saved it for their most spectacular pictures because it cost a fortune. So when the screen suddenly burst into colour, it felt like an event. You were watching the future arrive one gorgeous, slightly overcooked shade at a time, and you knew you were seeing something your parents never had. For your entire life up to this point, the movies has been black and white, and you thought nothing of it, because that was simply what movies looked like. The whole flickering world on that screen came in shades of grey, from bright white to deep black and everything in between. It was beautiful in its own way, all shadow and light, and you never once felt cheated by it, because you had never seen anything else. Grey was the colour of the movies, the way it had always been, and then colour began to creep in, and it was not the soft, natural colour we know today. It was something far more vivid and startling. The new process rendered everything in deep, glowing, almost impossibly rich hues. Reds that seemed to burn, blues so deep you could fall into them, greens like no forest ever quite managed in real life. It was a little bit unnatural, a little bit dialed up past reality, and that was exactly what made it so overwhelming to look at. It did not just show you colour, it practically shouted it. Because the process was so expensive and so complicated, the studios could not use it for everything. It cost a small fortune to shoot a picture in full colour, so they saved it, hoarding it for their grandest, most spectacular productions, the pictures they most wanted to dazzle you with. This turned colour itself into a special occasion. When you sat down to a film and the screen bloomed into those rich glowing hues, you knew immediately that you were watching something the studio had poured everything into. A genuine event. The effect on an audience who had only ever known grey was physical. That first burst of saturated colour could make a whole theatre gasp. It reached past your thinking mind and hit something deeper, a pure sensory jolt of wonder. To see a screen suddenly alive with colour, glowing and vivid in a decade so full of dull grey days, was a joy that went beyond the story being told. It was the sheer delight of your eyes drinking in something they had never tasted before. And there was a quiet significance to it, sitting there watching colour arrive. You were witnessing the future being born. This was something genuinely new under the sun, something your parents and grandparents had never seen, a technology unfolding right in front of your eyes. In a decade when so much felt like decline and loss, here was proof that human cleverness was still pushing forward, still inventing wonders, still finding new ways to make the world more beautiful. The future was coming, and it was coming in colour. It is a bit like the leaps we still get now, honestly. those moments when a screen suddenly shows us something sharper or richer than we knew was possible, and we feel that little spark of amazement. Except the jump from grey to glowing colour was more dramatic than almost anything since. A true transformation of what the movies could be. So you sat there, eyes wide, drinking in those gorgeous, slightly overcooked shades as the screen blazed with a richness you had never imagined. The future was arriving, one impossible colour at a time, and you had a front row seat. Your parents never saw the like. Lucky you. Now, everything you are watching tonight has quietly passed through a set of very strict rules, whether you realise it or not. By the middle of the decade, the industry was policing itself hard under a production code that decided what could and could not appear on screen. Couples slept in separate beds. Crime always got punished. Anything too spicy, too violent, or too honest got trimmed away before it ever reached your innocent eyes. The result was a strange, clever era, where filmmakers had to imply everything and show almost nothing, which, believe it or not, sometimes made the movies better. The rules were extensive and detailed, and the studios agreed to enforce them on themselves rather than have anyone else do it. The code laid out in careful terms exactly what the movies could and could not show. It set limits on violence, on romance, on crime, on language, on anything that might be considered indecent or improper. And it was not a vague suggestion. It was a real system with real teeth, and a film had to pass its approval before it could reach the screens of the great theatre chains. Some of the specific rules sound almost quaint today. A married couple on screen could not be shown sharing a bed. Instead, they slept in two separate, prim little beds with a respectable gap between them, which is a curious way to depict married life. Crime could be shown, but the criminal always had to be punished by the end because the movies were not allowed to let wrongdoing pay off. Anything too passionate, too brutal, too frank about the messier realities of human life. All of it was softened, trimmed, or cut away entirely long before you ever got to see it. The effect was to create a very particular kind of movie, one that had to become clever precisely because it could not be direct. If a filmmaker could not show you two people falling into bed, they had to find another way to make you feel the heat between them. A lingering look, a closing door, a cut to something else at just the right moment, letting your own imagination fill in everything that was not shown. The camera would drift away, or fade out, or find some sly little symbol to stand in for what could not be depicted. And here is the surprising part. All these restrictions, all these things the filmmakers were forbidden to show, often made the movies better rather than worse. When you cannot show everything, you have to suggest, to imply, to trust the audience to feel what you are hinting at. That demands wit and craft and cleverness. It forces artists to communicate through glances and gestures and timing, through what is left unsaid and unseen. Sometimes what your own imagination supplies is far more powerful than anything the screen could have shown you directly. There is a whole art to implication, and this era became a master of it. A raised eyebrow could say more than a page of dialogue. A door quietly closing could carry more charge than any explicit scene. The filmmakers of this time learned to speak in a rich, sly, suggestive language, saying everything while showing nothing, and audiences learned to read it fluently. It made the movies knowing and witty and full of delicious little secrets shared between the screen and the crowd. It is an interesting thing to sit with, honestly, the idea that a limit can sharpen an art rather than dull it. We tend to assume that fewer restrictions always mean better, freer work, But this era gently argues otherwise. Boxed in on every side, the filmmakers got cleverer, not weaker. So as you sat there enjoying your feature, entirely unaware of the invisible hand that had shaped every frame, you were watching artists work brilliantly inside a very tight cage. They could show you almost nothing, and yet somehow they made you feel everything. You cannot make this up. Between features, you might notice something odd happening on stage involving a big drum full of tickets. Welcome to the desperate genius of Depression-era promotions. To lure people in on slow nights, theatres ran giveaways with names like Bank Night, where a lucky ticket holder could win actual cash, which in 1936 could change your entire month. Others handed out a single piece of a matching dinner set every week, so that if you came faithfully enough, you could slowly assemble an entire collection of dishes. Half the country ate off tableware they earned by going to the movies. You cannot make this up. The theatres were fighting for survival, remember, and slow nights were the enemy. A half-empty house on a Tuesday was money lost that could never be recovered. So the owners got creative, dreaming up gimmicks and giveaways to fill those weak evenings with warm bodies and jingling coins. The most famous of these schemes went by names like Bank Night, and the idea was beautifully simple. Show up, get your name entered in a drawing, and you might just walk out with a pile of cash. And this was not pocket change. In a decade when a working man might bring home only a few dollars for a day of hard labour, the cash prize on offer could amount to a genuinely life-changing sum. Winning could mean covering a month's rent, paying off a debt, buying the family something they had gone without for years. So people packed the theatre on drawing nights, hearts pounding, clutching their tickets, praying that this would be the night their name got pulled from the big spinning drum on the stage. The whole thing became a communal event, thrilling and tense. The drawing would happen right there on stage between the features, with the whole crowd holding its breath. A name would be called, and either someone would leap up shrieking with joy, or the entire room would deflate together and resolve to come back and try again next week. It turned an ordinary movie night into a lottery, a shot at real hope, and it kept people coming back faithfully in the desperate belief that their luck was surely due. Other theatres ran a slower, sneakier kind of giveaway, and this one was pure genius. Instead of cash, they gave away dishes, but only one piece at a time. Come this week and get a single plate, come next week and get the matching cup, come the week after for a saucer, and on it went. To assemble a complete matching set of dinnerware, you had to keep coming back, week after week after week, collecting the pieces one by one like a very slow, very delicious trap. And it worked spectacularly. Families got hooked on completing their set, and that meant a standing weekly appointment at the movies for months on end. Miss a week, and you might miss the gravy boat, and then your beautiful matching collection would have a hole in it forever. So they came, faithfully, and slowly built up entire cupboards full of dishes earned one movie ticket at a time. It became so common that a huge number of American households were literally eating their dinners off tableware they'd collected at the picture show. It is the same hook that loyalty programs and collectible schemes use on us today, honestly. That itch to complete the set, to not miss out, to keep coming back for just one more piece. The theatres figured out the psychology of it long ago and used it to survive. So there you sat, watching a drum full of tickets spin on the stage, dreaming of a cash prize that could save your month, or quietly counting how many more Tuesdays until your dinner set was finally complete. You came for the movies, and you stayed for the dishes. A whole nation eating off its movie-going habit. You truly cannot make this up. If you really want chaos, come back on a Saturday afternoon, when the theatre filled up with a screaming ocean of children whose parents had discovered the cheapest babysitter in history. For a nickel, a kid got dropped off for hours of cartoons, comedies, and especially serials, and the ushers spent the entire time trying to keep several hundred sugar-fueled youngsters from staging a full riot. It was loud, it was sticky, and it was gloriously out of control. For a lot of those kids, that dark room with the giant screen was the best part of the whole week, and they never forgot it. The Saturday matinee was a completely different beast from the elegant evening show. In the evening, the palace was a place of glamour, of dressed-up adults and hushed romance and dreams of tuxedos. On Saturday afternoon, it was a zoo. The parents of the neighbourhood had collectively realised that for the price of a single nickel, they could hand off their energetic children to the theatre for hours and get an afternoon of blessed peace at home. It was, without question, the greatest bargain in the history of childcare. So the kids arrived by the hundreds, clutching their nickels, wild with excitement and freedom. The programme was tailored just for them, heavy on the things children loved most. Cartoons, of course, as many as they could pack in. Slapstick comedies full of pratfalls and pies, and above all the serials, those thrilling weekly chapters of adventure that hooked young minds even more fiercely than grown ones. For a kid, this was pure heaven, a whole afternoon of exactly the stuff they most wanted to see, with no parents around to spoil it. The behaviour, predictably, was atrocious in the best possible way. Several hundred children loaded up on candy packed into one dark room, with only a handful of teenage ushers standing between order and total anarchy. The kids yelled at the screen, they cheered the heroes and booed the villains at the top of their lungs. They threw things, they ran up and down the aisles, they squirmed and giggled and shrieked with delight through the entire programme, and the poor ushers waded through it all, flashlights waving, fighting a losing battle to keep the peace. It was loud, it was sticky, it was chaos, and it was wonderful. There was an energy to a Saturday matinee that no polite evening show could ever match. The raw, unfiltered joy of a room full of children who had escaped their parents and found paradise. When the serial hit its cliffhanger, and the hero was left, dangling over certain doom, the collective howl of anguish and delight from all those young voices could probably be heard down the block. These kids were not watching politely, they were living it, with their whole small bodies. And for so many of those children, this was the highlight of the entire week. Life could be hard for kids in this decade too, full of hand-me-downs and going without and parents worn thin by worry. But on Saturday afternoon, for one nickel, a child got to be a hero, got to escape into adventure, got to sit in a magical dark palace and feel pure, uncomplicated joy for a few hours. That was a gift, and it lodged deep. Many of those kids carried the memory of those Saturdays for the rest of their long lives. It is a bit like the way certain childhood ritual sticks with us forever. Honestly, that one weekly thing that meant everything when we were small. Ask anyone who was a child in that era, and their eyes will light up at the memory of those matinees. So picture it, that glorious madhouse, several hundred wild, sticky, howling children packed into the dark, cheering their hero and dreading the villain, having the time of their lives for the price of a nickel. It was chaos, it was joy, and it was, for a whole generation of kids, absolutely unforgettable. So there you have it. A whole night at the movies in 1930s America, from the quarter dug out of the coffee tin to the long cold walk back home. You dressed in your good coat for a room where no one could see you. You walked through dark and worried streets toward a wall of light. You handed over money you could barely spare and got, in return, a palace of marble and velvet, a ceiling full of painted stars, cool air in a brutal summer, and hours upon hours of laughter and adventure and glamour, all stacked on top of one thin ticket. And underneath all that wonder, there were real people, tired and frightened and stretched thin by the hardest decade anyone could remember. People who had lost jobs and savings and certainty, who carried worry with them everywhere they went, and who still, somehow, found one more coin for hope. They understood something we sometimes forget, which is that when the world turns heavy, joy is not a luxury. It is a kind of medicine, and it is worth every penny. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in a home you can heat with the turn of a dial, with a whole world of stories waiting in a glowing screen you barely have to reach for, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to those people in their good coats and shined shoes, walking home through the cold with a little borrowed light glowing in their chests. Because history is full of hard times, and hard times are full of stubborn, hopeful, ridiculous people who kept showing up, kept laughing in the dark, and kept believing that tomorrow might just be a little brighter. Sleep well. The palace will still be glowing in the morning,